So, infidelity is obviously one of our difficult topics, and I want to acknowledge that many of you may have experienced infidelity in your own family of origin or perhaps in your own romantic relationships. And you might have been the betrayer, or you might have been the betrayed. As you could imagine, affairs can be very devastating to a marriage. On the one hand, they're very, very highly traumatic for the betrayed partner. They can result in PTSD-like symptoms, which we're going to talk about. And infidelity is the most commonly cited reason for divorce around the world. Yet at the same time, as we're going to see, infidelity isn't uncommon, especially if you include emotional affairs. And the majority of couples who experience an affair actually stay together, which you might find surprising. Treatment can be effective. We'll look at an example of that. And the crisis of infidelity can be an opportunity for couples to reevaluate and strengthen their relationship. And you'll see some of this evidence, especially in the Esther Perel reading that we're doing. All right, so you can be thinking about how you would answer this iClicker. So Esther Perel is a couple and sex therapist who focuses on issues like infidelity. She's got books, TED Talks, podcasts, lots of interesting things that I'd encourage you to check out. And what you're going to see is that in this article, she really talks about how some couples can't recover from an affair. Some couples kind of miss the opportunity to really capitalize on and recover well from the affair. And then some couples really do recover well from the affair. So it'll be kind of interesting to talk about that. And then we're also going to come back to this idea of how open are you about the details of an affair. And then we're also reading a chapter from this book, Getting Past the Affair, by Snyder and Bauckham and colleagues. And these are academic clinicians and researchers. And they've written this book based on their treatment program for infidelity. So they've also done some preliminary research on this program, and then they wrote this book for couples. Generally, it's geared more towards the betrayed partner. And it's going to help us understand for the betrayed partner, what does the affair kind of shift about them, and how is it considered a traumatic event? In this PowerPoint, we're going to go over prevalence and definitions related to infidelity, then risk factors, the discovery of infidelity and its impact, and then treatment. All right, let's start with infidelity's prevalence and some definitions. Okay, so infidelity can be a range of sexual involvement, a range of emotional involvement. It can be online or in person. We do see higher rates of emotional infidelity as compared to sexual infidelity, and we'll get into some examples of what that might look like. Women generally have broader definitions of what's infidelity than men do. Men are more likely to restrict it to more sexual. Women are more likely to include emotional. Straight males are the most upset by sexual intimacy, but straight females and lesbian and gay males and females are more upset by emotional intimacy. And that's just some general findings. Not all research echoes that, but there are some trends in that direction. Okay, so you might just ask yourself on this, if your partner regularly emotionally confided in someone else, that could be a potential romantic partner for them, so not just a friend, would you consider that infidelity? If you're wanting how to figure out what's the difference between a friendship and an emotional affair, Shirley Glass, a longtime infidelity researcher and clinician, came up with this list of kind of questions to ask yourself. And if you answer yes to 3 or more of these, then you might be more than just friends. And so let's just read through those. Do you confide more to your friend than to your partner? Do you discuss negative feelings or intimate details about your marriage with your friend, but not with your partner? Are you open with your partner about the extent of your involvement with your friend? Would you feel comfortable if your partner heard your conversations with your friend? Would you be comfortable if your partner saw a video of your meeting? These 2 have been the most important for me in kind of keeping myself in check, right? If I want to make sure that I'm not getting inappropriate with somebody, I'm kind of thinking, okay, if Jordan was here right now, listening and watching me, would he be okay with this? Are you aware of sexual tensions in the friendship? Do you and your friend touch differently when you're alone versus in front of others? And are you in love with your friend? And so again, the general rule that she came up with is 3 or more, you might be more than just friends. Okay, it's always hard to get good numbers on the prevalence of infidelity. And these are lifetime stats, not in any given year. So sexual infidelity occurs in 20 to 25% of marriages, and that's across the lifetime of the marriage. 23% of men and 13% of women, according to the General Social Survey, which is a large national survey and probably our largest and most reliable source of data. Men, as you can see, are higher, generally higher in all forms of infidelity, with some research saying that perhaps for sexual and emotional, in some kind of meta-analyses, women will come up as in terms of similar rates in that combination. Some researchers say that it's declining, some say it's rising, some say it's staying the same. We might imagine that with online infidelity, I'm going to guess it's perhaps increasing. Here's what I think is really interesting, the paradox of infidelity. 60 to 75% of married couples stay married after learning about their partner's affair. And as we're going to learn, some of them create a happy, healthy marriage or restore one, and some of them continue to kind of be hurt and mistrustful. We really probably don't realize how many couples haven't experienced an affair because I think they're private about it, or perhaps even, as we're going to see, they're ashamed of staying together. Yet at the same time here, infidelity is the most cited reason for divorce globally. It's estimated that 40% of divorced individuals report the reason being, extramarital sex. Okay, so let's talk about online infidelity in particular. So researchers do struggle a little bit to define it, as with infidelity in general. Some researchers have talked about viewing porn secretly as online infidelity, and it certainly can feel like a betrayal, but most researchers require some form of interaction in order to distinguish the online, activity as infidelity. So we assume that it's rising. We don't have clear stats on its use. We know that a decent number of married couples still go on to dating apps. Examples of online emotional infidelity, and this could be in person too, are confiding in the other person. Oftentimes people are even talking about their marriage, with somebody else, flirting with them. And then, of course, a range of sexual behaviors, with increasing intensity, from just kind of sexual kind of chatting, sexting, sending pictures, and then, of course, cyber sex. And then, of course, online can lead to, meeting in person. Okay, Shirley Glass also has some kind of nice checking ourselves questions to keep us from moving into online infidelity, or to kind of catch ourselves if we are. So questions like, do you ever exit a screen because you don't want your partner to see what you're writing in a chat or an email? Could be a red flag. Would you feel comfortable if your partner saw all of your internet correspondence? Have you set up a separate email account to carry on a personal online correspondence? And have you exchanged photos of yourself with a secret email correspondent? Obviously, these are kind of more in degree of severity here. So one protective strategy against infidelity, I think, is to tell your partner if you have chemistry or attraction. So you're kind of asking them to help you monitor yourself. Because as we know, choosing to be monogamous doesn't mean that you're not going to experience attraction or chemistry about other people or dream about other people. I've asked my couple friends how they handle this, like, do they talk about it? And the answers really vary. My husband and I have always agreed to share if we've got chemistry with somebody. But for us, this has only happened about one time a decade. Whereas, I have friends who say they'd be telling their partner every day about a new hottie at the gym, and that doesn't quite seem right. So I think people use different strategies around this. Let's talk briefly about infidelity in non-monogamous couples. So what happens when a couple has consensual non-monogamy? That's a broad term used to describe intimate relationships that are negotiated between more than two people and are non-exclusive in some way, either sexually, emotionally, or a combination. And this term, consensual non-monogamy can be an umbrella term for polyamory, swinging, open relationships, which all kind of have slightly different definitions, but I won't get into that. And so what what infidelity looks like in those relationships is typically it's non-consensual non-monogamy equals infidelity. Basically, we didn't agree that you could go outside the relationship in this way. And that's typically because couples who are practicing consensual non-monogamy have rules, like, whether or not you can have sex in our house, whether or not your sex partner can sleep over, whether or not you can see the same person more than once, what you can do when you're having sex, and are you allowed to create an emotional attachment to them, or is this just a sexual attachment? So infidelity happens if these rules are broken, essentially. All right, let's switch into talking about risk factors for infidelity. Here's some demographic risk factors. It's older. I haven't been able to get more recent data. This is from the General Social Survey data between 2010 and 2016. And what you can see there is that, again, men were the highest, women lower. In terms of racial and ethnic backgrounds, Hispanic Americans were the lowest, Black Americans were higher. Age, you see higher rates as people get older, but keep in mind this is the lifetime prevalence, not in any given year. So it makes sense that it would go up by age because, for example, in my 50s, I've had a lot more decades to have an affair than I did when I was 25. So we can see there's not big differences based on education. In terms of political orientation, Democrats are higher. Growing up in terms of rates of infidelity, growing up in a single parent household or without two parents is slightly higher risk of infidelity, and lack of religious attendance is more likely to have an affair. Okay, so as we go through these couple of slides on risk factors, first just note that nothing is like the slam dunk risk factor. Most of these have just small to medium, no large effects, and so there can be multiple contributing factors. So relationship factors are often, what we turn to, and on average, yes, people who have an affairs generally have lower relationship and sexual satisfaction, lower commitment. Of course, that can be bidirectional too. It can be that as you invest more in this affair, you're not as investing as much in your relationship and you're losing satisfaction there. When I initially was being trained as a marriage and family therapist, this was the basic idea. There's something that the basic kind of theory is that there was something broken in their relationship that led someone to have an affair, and we have to help them figure out what that was and fix it. Since that time, some researchers have found that at least maybe half of men and a third of women say that they were happily married at the time that they had an affair. And Esther Perel, who you're reading, suggests that it isn't always about flaws in the marriage, but that we're seeking another self. We're turning away from the person that we have become. And I can relate to this in midlife. Like, have you just gotten a little bored with yourself, maybe bored with your marriage, and you're just turning towards something that makes you feel alive or is more exciting? And then, we've talked in this class about homogamy or similarity. And so heterogamy, which is the opposite of that, being more different in terms of levels of religiosity and education, can be a risk factor. Again, not a big one though. In terms of work, 50% of infidelity is with coworkers. And as far as I know, that's still standing even with online. Could be wrong though. Particularly so if you have more travel, if your job has a lot of potential contact, a lot of personal contact with potential partners. So for example, if you're a straight male, having a lot of women in your workplace is related to a higher risk of infidelity. And then interestingly, having both spouses employed decreases your risk of cheating as compared to one person working and the other person staying at home, which is a higher risk of infidelity. Just I'll mention as an aside, research about the presence of kids is pretty inconclusive. On the one hand, it can increase the sense of investment in the relationship, but it can also decrease relationship and sexual satisfaction. Okay, so some individual risk factors, and again, keep in mind these are small, so don't panic if you have these. So In terms of the big five personality traits, if we are lower on agreeableness and conscientiousness and higher on neuroticism, that puts us more at risk. If we're higher in terms of impulsivity, that's not a big five, but still kind of a personality characteristic. If we've had prior infidelity in our own romantic relationships or in our family of origin. And in fact, having infidelity in our family of origin increases our risk 2 times of experiencing it in our own romantic relationships. So we want to really be kind of aware of that. It makes sense if we have more permissive attitudes towards sex. Also, if we've had more sexual partners in the past, that's a risk factor. Substance use issues can be a risk factor because then maybe you're not using your good judgment. Insecure attachment has been decently researched. Some studies find both evidence of both anxious and avoidant styles. Some find just evidence of avoidance. And then adverse childhood experiences or traumatic experiences growing up, including death of a parent, divorce of parents, neglect, or abuse. And the mechanism is that these then increase the risk of attachment insecurity, which then increases the risk of infidelity. At least that's what some researchers have found. Okay, so test yourself on this, and the answer here is D, impulsivity. Okay. I find this research fascinating, and I bet you will too, but one risk factor for heterosexual females is ovulation. So remember, ovulation is only happening for females when they're not on hormonal birth control, and it's this approximately 5-day window in between menstrual cycles when their body is trying to make a baby or open to making a baby. And a lot of this research that I'm going to present to you is older, yet even more recent reviews have confirmed this older research. I have not yet found research, although it might be out there. Let me know if you find it on lesbian women, gay men, in terms of any phenomenon around this, or kind of any responses to ovulating women. Let's see. So when heterosexual females are ovulating, they are more likely to dress in kind of a more attractive or sexy way. They're also more likely to restrict calories. And as we're going to see, they actually do get more of that hourglass kind of shape. I suspect what happens is, when you have your period, you're all bloated, you eat more. And I think the opposite is happening during ovulation. You shed water weight and you eat less. Ovulating women are more likely to be flirty. They're more likely to go out to a bar without their partner when they're ovulating. They report a greater attraction to males outside their other males when they're ovulating, particularly men who are more masculine or more dominant or have more symmetrical features. This is when women are more likely to, straight women are more likely to have sex outside their relationship, to have an affair. And interestingly, they're more able to accurately identify a male's sexual orientation when they're ovulating. Heterosexual males rate ovulating women as more attractive, as healthier, that they smell better, that their voice sounds better, that their body is more symmetric. And you remember that symmetry is something that we generally find attractive in mate selection. And some of that, apparently the ear length of ovulating women does actually become more symmetrical, which is bizarre. They rate kind of more of an hourglass shape and pinker cheeks, which sometimes it appears to be a finding that's generally supported, but sometimes mixed. So what's the takeaway from this? Straight women who aren't on hormonal birth control need to pay attention to when they're ovulating and be aware that they might have some unexpected attractions that they want to be thoughtful before they act on if they're in a monogamous relationship. For example, I'll tell you just a little story about me. I remember right after I'd had a baby, I went to a nursery around Christmas time to get a Christmas tree, and it was just me. Jordan and Isaac were back at home, and I was picking out my tree, and normally, I'm like, I'll get the tree myself. I can strap it to my car. I don't need any help. But this guy came out, and his name was John, and he looked like a lumberjack, and he was tall, and he had a square jaw, and he was kind of broad-chested, and he was like, "Would you like some help with that tree?" And suddenly I just felt something in me shift. I was like, got all breathy and a little too close to him, like, oh yes, I'd love some help with my tree. And later when I got in the car, I was like, Ashley, what in the heck is wrong with you? You're so happily married, you have a baby. And then I thought about it as I was driving home. I was like, oh, I'm just ovulating. That's all that is. And so my husband and I, when I used to ovulate, I'm in menopause now, so that doesn't happen to me anymore. We used to joke about it a lot and keep track of it, and I'd say stuff like, okay, I'm going on a work trip, but I'm ovulating. My husband was like, you better be careful. And I also, it helped me normalize if I was in a meeting and suddenly I had this attraction to this guy across the meeting, and I've been in meetings with him before and I never was attracted to him. I could be like, oh, it's just ovulation. It's going to be gone the next time we have this meeting. I don't have to worry about it. It doesn't really mean anything. And you might also notice that straight guys are looking at you more, and that's just, part of ovulation as well. Okay, let's talk about what happens when affairs are discovered and the effects or impact of affairs. So this was a research study on online infidelity specifically, but I think it could translate to in person. It was a qualitative research study just involving a small number of people, like 11 people over 3 focus groups. So, take it with a grain of salt, but I think it gives it makes sense, how they're laying it out. That initially, maybe, for example, we are suspicious with that something's not right with our partner. They seem more distant, or they seem to be protecting, their phone more, or more into privacy on their phone. So we've got something that's like our spidey senses are going off. And then we have the investigation where maybe we look through their phone, for example, or try to get access to passwords and on the computer, maybe, for example, while they're sleeping or while they're gone. And then there's the discovery phase where we find something, usually, electronically, like on a phone or a computer, but maybe we hear it from somebody else. Maybe we get an STI that we shouldn't have, and we start wondering what's going on. Then there's the confrontation and the response. And the response can be a range of denial to acknowledge and varying levels of responsibility or defensiveness or shame and panic. Then we move into more of a forgiveness relationship limbo period, and we're going to talk more about forgiveness, but this is where we're not sure what to do, how much to let it go. Forgiveness, we can almost feel ashamed for forgiving someone and staying with them, and we don't want to tell anybody about that. And then it could be we end the relationship, or we recommit. In this small study of just 11 people, everybody ended the relationship. Either way, in this same relationship or future relationships, we're going to be making likely some new rules. For example, we're going to share our passwords, but we promise not to go through each other's phones unless we're really worried. As you're reading in Bauckham and Snyder, affairs can be a traumatic event, and they can create symptoms that are very similar to post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Typically, infidelity can't qualify for PTSD because of criterion A, which says that the individual must have experienced, witnessed, or learned about an event that involved actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So, although it may not still qualify, a lot of the symptoms still coexist of PTSD. So, emotions like shame, rage, depression, and anxiety. So, for example, women who experienced their husband's infidelity were much more likely to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder, higher amounts of hypervigilance or paranoia, like watching, worrying, feelings of victimization, having nightmares, having intrusive memories, images come in, or even if they're imagined, pop in, like imagining your partner with their affair partner. Feeling kind of threatened and insecure in your relationship, either this one or future romantic relationships, kind of just numbing or disassociating because it's just too much. You start to shut down. You can't concentrate. People struggle with insomnia. Weight loss is actually pretty common. Not that I'd recommend it as infidelity as a weight loss strategy. And then not related to trauma and PTSD, jealousy, of course, is incredibly high for betrayed partners. Affairs can be conceptualized as an attachment injury. And then extramarital sex is typically correlated with lower condom use and higher risk of STIs. This research was written by a clinician just based on 3 decades of work with couples struggling with affairs. And what she found is that she saw 4 different patterns in terms of the effects on the sexual relationship following an affair. So, and you could have, more than one of these, or you could move around, but one could just be a decrease in sexual activity or abstinence, like don't ever touch me again, you know, and maybe the experience of STIs is contributing to that. And so, of course, we would want to give the betrayed partner really a lot of control over deciding, what feels right or not. Increased sexual activity. And this can take 3 forms. Like it's kind of reactive, like we've got to save the relationship, I've got to have more sex to kind of get them back. It can be rebonding, just like recommitting ourselves, maybe helping the betrayed partner feel more desirable. And it can be this just kind of surprising eroticism, which is somehow the thought of your partner being with someone else increases their sexual desirability for you. You suddenly see them as an object of sexual desire in a way that you hadn't before. But people can feel really ashamed or ambivalent about this. Like my partner just cheated on me and now I'm super turned on and I want to have sex with them. That can feel not great, even though it's normal. We can have increased sexual dysfunction, erectile dysfunction, sexual pain, inability to orgasm, low sexual desire. And then there can also be shifts in people's sexual scripts. So maybe they're kind of realizing we had some sexual boredom. Now we're challenging the old scripts, more expression and sexual variety. All right, let's finish off by talking about the treatment of infidelity. Okay, so, just your opinion, how successful do you think a couple could be from healing from an affair? And what do you think it depends on? Some of the things I think about is, are we sure that the affair has ended? Obviously, if an affair continues to be ongoing, and the person kind of has implied that it's ended, that's going to be really tough. If this person has had serial affairs, one after the other, if this was a really long affair, if this was a person close to you in some way, or to your family, therapy can make a difference, of course, and then how much is the person taking responsibility? So let's talk more about couples treatment. So as Esther Perel suggested, some couples can report closer marital relationships following an affair. They can get stronger. You're reading the Baucom, Snyder, and Gordon chapter, and their model, and they wrote this book for the lay public, but it's based on their clinical model, basically combines CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, so helping people kind of sort through behaviors and cognitions, as well as insight-oriented couples therapy, so kind of making meaning, understanding why this happened with a trauma lens, so kind of trauma-informed care. And in a pilot research study, 4 out of 6 couples showed positive gains following treatment. Last I checked, they have not replicated this with a bigger study. There's a lot of articles written about treatment of infidelity, but very few clinical trials testing it out. So this is the Baucom and Snyder couples treatment model, and divided into 3 stages. And so what I really like about this model, as you'll see in the first stage, is that you try to slow couples down about trying to make an immediate decision about staying together or splitting up, although some people do just make an immediate decision. But if they've called for therapy, you try to slow them down. And maybe you help them come up with a time frame. Like maybe we can take this, whatever, next month, next 2 months, to try to talk things through and decide, rather than trying to feel like we have to make this decision, immediately. And maybe we're also creating some boundaries about, are we staying in the same house or not? Who's sleeping where? Are we having sex or not? You're, of course, dealing with all the emotions on both sides, the trauma of the betrayed partner, and also the grief of the affair partner, which they really can hardly say to anybody but a therapist, because nobody wants to hear it, that they're sad for giving up what was a pretty positive experience generally. And so you're providing psychoeducation, normalization, you're helping them with self-care so that they feel normal and not crazy and have strategies when things get really intense, especially for the betrayed partner. You're helping them think about when their conversations get too intense, what are they going to do? And that can be taking time outs, that can be venting techniques around writing letters rather than saying things to one another's faces when things are too intense. And then trying to have them figure out what to do about sharing details. And these are sometimes called the gory details. And couples and therapists vary on what they think about this. Bauckham, they say, for example, don't go there. Don't go into the gory details. Stick with the basics facts, not like frequency, not how much, like, how often did this happen, not sexual positions. Esther Perel, on the other hand, would say, maybe it's okay to go there with some questions. Maybe not all, but talking about intimacy creates intimacy. And Shirley Glass had a similar kind of idea around walls and windows. There used to be a wall between the betrayed partner and the affair, and now you're trying to give them a window, so that they can see into it. What I would suggest, and what others have suggested, is coming up with a pre-conversation about how to go about it. So rather than just the betrayed partner just blasting the affair partner with all their questions, maybe they need to write down all their questions and bring them into therapy and put them in order in terms of the, least sensitive to the most sensitive, and start with the least and do a couple of them and just see how that sits before you just go down the whole list. Okay, so then in stage 2, the meaning making stage, they're trying to make meaning from an individual level. How did this happen? How did I let this happen? What's my piece here and in our system? And then you're trying to kind of, with that, create a coherent narrative, so that we can have a story. How do we explain this to ourselves so that we can avoid it in the future, either in this relationship or in a future one? Then in stage 3, moving on, and this can be staying together or not, but here we're trying to figure out what to do about forgiveness. This has been written about a lot in the affair literature, and some people think that it's necessary, and some people think that it's unrealistic. I think of forgiveness not as a one-time event, but an ongoing process. And I think it's much easier to forgive someone if the affair partner is, and this comes from Janet Abrams Spring, I think, Janice Abrams Spring's work. The affair partner has to just hold it, right? They have to agree to hold the affair and get out the affair whenever the betrayed partner wants to talk about it. That's not usually what happens. Usually the affair partner is like, it's over, it's in the past, let's push it under the rug, I don't want to talk about it again, because they're so ashamed, right? And that just makes, when you think about systems, the betrayed partner want to hold on to it more. So you counteract that by the affair partner saying, I'm going to hold this. This was so huge. I know this affected you. Whenever you're worried, whenever you're scared, I want you to feel like you can bring it up. If I'm going on a work trip and you're panicking, let's talk about it and let's come up with some strategies so that you can feel safer. And then, yes, people are deciding whether or not to stay together and having kind of maybe a more realistic view of their relationship. I've got a few more slides on forgiveness related to infidelity, which I think is such a fascinating topic. And so this information on these next few slides is mostly drawn from an article by Coate and colleagues who reviewed the clinical and empirical research on forgiveness since 1970 and came up with 35 articles that they summarized. And so this first slide is just about what are the factors that influence the success of the forgiveness process. And so it's going to be influenced, the likelihood of, forgiveness, or having kind of a successful sense of resolution can be influenced by, how intense was the affair, like how involved, right? How much emotional connection, sexual involvement, what's the length, is this a one-night stand versus many years? Was it serial affairs? What's the context around the affair? Was it, a family friend or someone that the couple, the betrayed partner did not know? How it's also the success of forgiveness is going to be influenced by just in general how much relationship satisfaction there is, how much commitment to the relationship. So more committed couples are going to be more likely to kind of hang in there, and the couple's conflict resolution skills. Forgiveness is harder to achieve if either partner has a really hard time tolerating distress or regulating emotion, because it's going to be intense, as we're going to talk more about. Or if the affair partner has more antisocial or narcissistic traits, that will make forgiveness harder. Or if the betrayed partner has more intense PTSD, perhaps from the affair, and has a really hard time letting go of the betrayal. Okay, so a bit more from the Coate review article. They identified basically a 6-step clinical or therapeutic process of forgiveness that couples can be working through with the help of a therapist, and that therapists are facilitating. And even though it's this 6-step process and it kind of has a somewhat linear or sequential quality to it, we also know that couples can do this in an iterative or circular way, meaning they might do step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, circle back to step 2, do step 3, do step 4 again, if that makes sense. Okay, we've got the first 3 steps on this slide. And so the first one is education, and that is provided by the therapist, and just helping the couple understand that forgiveness isn't forgetting or accepting or excusing, and that it might not be a one and done. The second stage is exploration of vulnerable emotion, and so hence that need to be able to tolerate distress and have decent emotion regulation skills. So this is kind of for both the affair partner, for example, is really often needing to explore and get in touch with their shame, which they typically don't want to do. They want to be like, it's over, I promise it'll never happen again, because it's so hard to talk about and they can feel such shame. But some empirical research has found that for the affair partner, exploring and expressing their shame accounts for about a third of the variance in predicting whether or not the forgiveness process works. So it's really important, even though it's uncomfortable. The affair partner also has to be very empathic to their partner's distress. They can't be wanting to just shove that under the rug. The betrayed partner has to understand that the affair happened for complex reasons, and that it wasn't like their partner just wanted to hurt them, which is maybe sometimes what they're thinking. And then in terms of step 3, assuming responsibility, the affair partner has to, even though there are multiple factors, including maybe the betrayed partner influencing the affair partner does have to own it, as this was their choice, this is their responsibility, and they have to be willing to feel and express empathy for the pain that they caused their partner. And the betrayed partner has to recognize that, yeah, they probably contributed to the context, they may have, but they aren't responsible, for that choice to have an affair. Okay, here's steps 4 through 6. So step 4, sincere apologies. This obviously doesn't work if you haven't done the hard kind of emotional gut-wrenching work of stages 2 and 3. And it still might need to be repeated a few times. Like you might have to do a sincere apology as the affair partner. Then you might have to go back, listen to more, get in touch more with your own shame, share that. And then kind of apologize again. So it's, again, not a one and done. And then step 5, commitment to change. This is a commitment to no current or future affairs. And how are we in a plan to prevent it? So not just it's never going to happen again, but how are we going to know it's not going to happen again? And so we have to make sure that there's no chance that we're not going to have contact with the affair partner. Or at least in the same way if there's somebody in our workplace. That ideally there's some other folks who know, maybe the affair partner's best friend or something like that, who says, I'm going to keep an eye on them and I'm going to tell the betrayed partner if I have any concerns. And that sounds a little odd to me, but that came up across several approaches. And that the injured or betrayed partner has the opportunity to, at any time, express their concerns, express their fears, their doubts, and get reassurance. And then step 6 is present and future choices. And this is, deciding what we're doing about the relationship and creating this narrative of resilience, either our resilience as a couple or our resilience as individuals, deciding to move on separately from here. I will say clinical approaches vary on whether or not there has to be this formal request for forgiveness, like from the affair partner to the betrayed partner. Some clinical approaches include that and some do not. They just have the apology. This video by Esther Perel, who you did the reading from, is amazing. It's all good. I tried to think of shortening it, but it's all great. It's got millions and millions and millions of views. I would highly recommend it. And she has so many amazing quotes. And so you might think about, as you listen to it, what's 1 or 2 quotes that you want to remember? And I have one up there from her. Your first marriage is over. Would you like to create a second one together? Great job making it to the end of another one.